Can Pokemon change its battle formula? And if so, how much could they change it? For a long time now, I've been a big advocate for variety in Pokemon games. I don't want every generation to be the same game over and over. But I used to think that while the premise and the story and the structure of the game as a whole could all change, the battles could not, because they've got a whole competitive scene around the existing battle system. Changing that too much would pose a significant challenge to high-level players and potentially drive them away. Pokemon Legends Arceus made me start to question that view. It is the most different main series Pokemon game. The plot, the setting, the objectives are all completely novel, which is exactly what I'd been hoping to see, but the battles are different too, and on a pretty fundamental level. Legends is not a competitive Pokemon game. It's so focused on the single-player experience that it doesn't even have PvP, so it's hard to say how much of what it changed could be expected to carry forward into Scarlet and Violet and future VGC titles. But it still got me wondering how much the actual VGC format could change. I'm just a VGC noob, though. I've only dabbled in it since Sun and Moon, and I play ranked battles and the occasional online competition very casually. So I got in touch with some people who could help me out.
I'm Dove, or Joseph. I'm one of Israel's top competitive players, the former national champion in an unofficial sense, just due to the fact that we don't have TPC official tournaments here yet. I make content on YouTube and Twitch.
Hello, my name is Aditya Subramanian. You may know me as Adi or as CK49. I am a Pokemon VGC competitor as well as a content creator.
I started Pokemon in 2004, right when Fire and Leaf Green came out, a little shortly after, because I received my first copies for my birthday. I didn't get into competitive until really started in X and Y, because the post game was just incredibly boring for me and I needed what to do. So I started off saying, okay, let me breed a competitive, like a perfect Charizard. And then it turned into a competitive Venusaur and a competitive Blastoise. And it just spiraled out of control until by Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, I ended up entering my first tournament with a team of competitively viable Pokemon, and I got thrashed in the first round. I spent the next year, really learning the game a bit better. And about a year later, I got my first trophy in a local tournament.
I've been playing Pokemon, the franchise, since I was a little kid, as most people have. I got into competitive Pokemon when I started high school. I learned about the Smogon forums, which is a hub for singles. It's a grassroots organization, and started playing there. Took a little bit of a break through high school and college, but I always really enjoyed watching VGC. I decided I wanted to go to events when I had the opportunity to, and so in 2017, when I graduated college, I finally had the money. I was in a more convenient location, and so I started traveling to events. Since then, I've cut regionals. I've done very well in various online tournaments in this last couple of years, and qualified for the World Championships in 2019, and now once again in 2022.
So even though I've been playing Pokemon for a lot longer than either of these guys, they've got a lot more experience in competitive Pokemon than I do. They helped me understand a little bit more of what it's like to play at a high level, how to adapt to a changing metagame, and what the limits might be to those changes. And the game does change at least a little bit with each generation. Not only do you have new Pokemon and new moves every time, but every generation has also made bigger changes to how the format works, like adding new types, introducing abilities, splitting physical and special moves, or changing how turn order is calculated, plus the generational gimmicks, Mega Evolution, Z-moves, Dynamax. But while over time the accumulated changes are very significant, they usually happen in a pretty incremental manner. If you know how to play one generation, you can figure out how to play the next one.
Gen 7, it wasn't that rough. It was still fairly easy. I was still, I had my game on top. I still had my nasty strategies, and everything still worked pretty fine. It wasn't that hard to really, relearn things, because I feel like Z-moves weren't as, central to the metagame as Dynamax is now.
Dynamax, as far as generational mechanics goes, has been a much more drastic shift than any of the other, than Z-moves or than Mega Evolutions were, or even Gems were in Generation 5. It's definitely something you have to get used to. The speed mechanics especially are something that you sort of internalize, and you have to get used to the change. But that being said, a lot of VGC is just practice. You have to play a lot of games. As you play games, you start to learn the new mechanics, it starts to become more familiar, you get more comfortable with it. Part of it is just like reading and absorbing the information. And I think I did a pretty good job of that. The new mechanics weren't a huge barrier. The other thing is, once you mess something up and you lose a game because of it, it sticks with you forever.
I'm already just scared of what they're going to throw in a Scarlet and Violet that's just going to throw me off. I just hope it's not going to be something that's going to drive us all crazy.
When the changes are incremental, you can put in the time to overcome whatever it is that you're struggling with, even if it's a mechanic that you don't like.
I struggled a lot more when Dynamax came in. I struggled hard, and I only really sort of got a hang of it like about a year ago. Honestly, despise the mechanic. A lot of people like it. I personally hate it.
I don't think anyone fully understands the depth of the new mechanics right away. And so the people who were best able to take advantage of them were the people who really succeeded early on, and then everyone else had to learn from those players. A good example of that is the first regional of the year in 2020 was Dallas Regionals, and it was won by Aaron Trailer, who was using a Gigantamax Charizard team. Pop quiz: how much damage does Gmax Wildfire, Charizard's signature move, do at the end of each turn? It does 1/6. But at the beginning of the format, everyone assumed it did 1/8 because that's what things like Fire Spin do. That's a big difference to go from 1/6 damage to 1/8 damage over the course of 4 turns, hitting both Pokemon. And so people didn't realize how good that move was until after Aaron won with it and really showed off, like, hey, we didn't fully understand this mechanic. He got an advantage at the early format because he understood how the mechanic worked better than everyone else.
Okay, so in the past, some changes to Pokemon battles did have significant effects that took some learning to properly adapt to. But Pokémon Legends Arceus introduced a lot of changes. If it had been a competitive game, it probably would have been one of, if not the greatest generational shift in how the game is played.
I didn't really consider how it would convert to competitive until you brought it up, but that's a really good question.
I still don't feel like that's going to carry over into Scarlet and Violet. There are certain things I hope that do, but I definitely don't think those battle mechanics would work in a VGC setting. It's just too chaotic.
Not all of the changes were without precedent. You may remember that Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee didn't feature abilities or hold items, removing 2 layers of complexity from the battles. That also wasn't a VGC game, but because it did include online battles, we got a taste of what that metagame might be like.
I remember people tried for like 5 minutes to see if they can make a functional metagame out of it, and they gave up instantly. They're like, no, this isn't going to work. You really can't take away the items, you can't take away the abilities.
But Legends didn't just take away items and abilities. The game has no confusion, no flinching, no spread moves. Moves like Rollout and Outrage don't lock you in. Actually, a whole bunch of moves work completely differently than before. Offensive stat boosts affect both attack and special attack, so like Nasty Plot and Sword Stance do the same thing. And likewise, defensive boosts affect both defense and special defense. But on top of that, boosts don't stack, and they're temporary.
Getting a Sword Stance boost is still really valuable because you're probably going to win the game in, a couple turns. But now, if you stat drop your opponent multiple times with like Intimidate, for example, which is very common in VGC, that is less effective because that Pokemon will eventually get its stats back. And so that is no longer an effective way of dealing with something like nowadays Calyrex Ice, where a common strategy is to get it to, -3, -4 attack with multiple Intimidates until it's not doing any damage. So that's a really big change that would impact the metagame significantly. And then similarly, stat boosts wearing off impacts defensive stat boosters. So Pokemon like Regirock or Ferrothorn, their entire game plan is boost up their defenses as much as possible so you can't KO them. Is no longer works because you will eventually lose those defense boosts.
Legends also changed how weather works, both what kinds of weather are available, like you have snow instead of hail, and what effects they have.
Chlorophyll is one of the strongest abilities that you can have. And Chlorophyll, of course, doubles the speed of grass types in Sun, or the Pokemon that has Chlorophyll in Sun, which are normally grass types. Boosting the speed of grass types in Sun overall, like they do in Legends Arceus, is a really, really big buff to the type. And also kind of neuters, or not neuters, but it takes away the niche that a thing like Venusaur had, having that ability Chlorophyll that is so powerful.
And then there's the changes to status conditions, not only making them replaceable so that you can inflict paralysis on a burned Pokemon and it'll lose the burn, but also doing away with sleep in favor of drowsy, and more importantly, dropping freeze for frostbite.
Freeze was just a horribly broken status condition, and I think it deserves to die and be replaced with frostbite, because we've been saying for a while, what if they had burn, but instead it affected the special stat? There's your answer. You have frostbite, and I think just leave it at that. It's good.
Freeze is an awful mechanic. It is totally luck-based, and it just adds so much variation that doesn't need to be there, and frostbite is a great change, in my opinion. I'd love to see that incorporated.
All of these kinds of changes that we've talked about, maybe they're not all equally likely or equally desirable to stick around for future competitive Pokemon games, but they do all seem possible. Some of them would have very significant effects on how VGC is played, and maybe those changes would be enough to drive some people away, but it seems likely that, in general, most people would be able to adapt. Players like Dove may not have been fond of an unofficial meta that doesn't include items or abilities the way it was in Let's Go, but if it became the official meta, they could probably make it work.
It sort of consumed my life, so I don't see myself dropping Pokemon anytime soon, unless, they'd have to turn it into, a crazy MOBA. Oh, wait, they did that already. It's an RPG. As long as it sticks with the JRPG mechanics, I'll find a way to relearn it if I have to, but as long as they don't fundamentally change the entire thing, we're good.
But Pokemon Legends did also make a change that is fundamental. You've probably been wondering when this was going to come up.
Yeah.
The way that traditional Pokemon battles work is that both players input their commands at the same time. You lock in your choices, and then the turn plays out. This is pretty similar to classic game theory scenarios like the Prisoner's Dilemma, a scenario where two people are making decisions simultaneously but independently, and what is the ideal choice depends on what the other person chooses. Whether I should switch out my Whimsicott for a Ferrothorn depends on whether you're attacking with Sludge Bomb or Flamethrower. A perfectly rational player will try to pick the option that will give them the best results, no matter what the other person chooses. A Pokemon battle is much more complex than a standard Prisoner's Dilemma, but the way to succeed at a high level is still to find that course of action that will leave you with an advantage no matter what the opponent does. Pokemon Legends doesn't have that.
In Arceus, you make your move, and then your opponent makes their move. Sometimes you get to make your move twice, and then they get to make their move, but you get to see what your opponents did first. And so that's less like a Prisoner's Dilemma type situation, where it's more it's less like game theory, like traditional Pokemon, and more like a card game, or more like chess.
You can think of this as a change to the speed mechanic, and that wouldn't be inaccurate because the speed stat does decide turn order, but it would also be incomplete.
VGC is a really interesting game because of the simultaneous decision-making aspect. If you think about other common strategy games like chess, like poker, like the Pokemon trading card game or Magic the Gathering, none of those have simultaneous decision-making. The changing the way that you actually make your decisions is considerably different, and I think changes the game on a more fundamental level. I think Pokemon is this really cool example of game theory in action. That's obviously very abstract, but it does something that very few other games do, certainly no other major competitive games do. When people think about what good Pokemon players do, people think about predictions, right? And knowing what your opponent is going to do. And if you take that away, that takes away some of the most exciting moments in Pokemon as a viewer, as well as some of the most skill testing aspects of Pokemon as a competitor. And I really think that is just the core of competitive Pokemon. By turning it into a turn-by-turn, full information type game, it would just be less interesting. I think that at that point, I think I would switch to a trading card game just because I'm already a little invested in trading card games, and I think that just fundamentally takes away from what competitive Pokemon is.
Because Pokemon Legends is not a VGC title, they have the freedom to experiment a lot more with the battle format. At the moment, we don't know how much of what Legends did differently will carry forward into future Pokemon titles. Some changes would be very welcome, others would not. But what I got from my conversations with Adi and Dove is that as long as they keep that core of simultaneous decision-making, maybe they could be more radical with what they do change. Pokemon players are adaptable. As long as they don't take away the thing that makes VGC special, the players will find a way. That was the thesis that I wanted to focus on, but there was another angle that Adi and Dove spoke about that I think is important to touch on, so here's a bit of a postscript. Because even if players are adaptable, it would probably still be pretty challenging if every 3 years with each new generation, they just dumped a whole pile of new adjustments on top of their player base.
Maybe it would actually pay for them going forward to just separate the two things entirely, just have one game where you adventure with your Pokemon, you do the stuff, and the battle functions similarly to Legends of Arceus, and you can catch Pokemon in that game and transfer them to a stadium-like game and just edit stuff on the fly without, like in Showdown, where you don't have to, spend hours grinding, where you don't have to go and harvest cash or watts or whatever. You just can edit everything right there.
Decoupling VGC from the main series could be an interesting way to allow the games to be distinct and independent while still having the competitive meta evolve at a steadier pace. Rather than having big waves of meta-defining changes every few years, these changes could be introduced in smaller bursts. New Pokemon could be added a few at a time, sort of like how Pokemon Go does it. Move pools, abilities, and even stat spreads could be adjusted over time with balance patches.
There's just so much stuff they need to balance. It's ridiculous.
As things stand, they seem to have to rebalance the game more or less from scratch with every new generation. But maybe if they did it on a more ongoing basis, they'd be able to avoid Incineroar and Zacian being on every other team. Plus, with the way that the main series games are famously bad at preparing players for the competitive scene, a game that focuses exclusively on VGC could be really helpful for onboarding new players and giving established players the tools to hone their skills.
That is absolutely the number one request from every VGC player is please give us a best of 3 ladder. Just somewhere to practice best of 3s would be really, really helpful in making it easier to prepare for events.
One of the biggest things that annoys me about Pokemon, especially lately, is the fact that it is just the biggest multimedia franchise. But it doesn't have an esport that is as popular as League of Legends. And when it very much can, if they would invest in the marketing for it, if they would invest in proper resources.
Having just recently attended a Pokemon Regional Championship, I agree. The events could be much bigger than they are.
I dream of a future where Pokemon is a big Major League esport, where it's played in stadiums, it's played in massive convention halls. It's just the matter of just making sure the resources are all in place.
A game that focuses on the VGC scene, teaching competitive Pokemon, giving players the place to practice, making battles a true spectacle, that would go a long way.
And that's something that I wonder if they're going to move towards more, given how they released the Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl, which didn't have VGC compatibility, and Pokemon Legends Arceus, which also didn't have this online battling system. They might, in Generation 9, do something similar where, okay, we have this mainline game, it's going to have competitive Pokemon on this, and then we're also going to release 2 more games that are main series games, but aren't as focused on competitive, and are going to explore all these different ideas. And that might be a way to continue to make Pokemon Legends Arceus style games without disrupting VGC as much, while also doing what you said and focusing these games more on competitive so that it is an avenue for players to get into VGC.
You can't really change the fundamental core of the game, but you could do more to encourage it.
I want to say thank you to Dove and Adi for their time and insights. Joe Assad also answered my questions on this topic, and Rosemary Kelly directed me to Adi and Joe. Thank you all so much for your generosity. Thank you also to my patrons and channel members for supporting my work, especially luxury patron Ethan from Chicago. And of course, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter.